Wednesday afternoon, as I'm always here, 5 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I am your host, Ian Hamilton, Trottier. You've joined me for discussions, and today we will have a discussion with author Ellen Brown. Ellen Brown is the founder, and president of the Public Banking Institute, a nonpartisan think tank devoted to the creation of a publicly ran banking system. Ellen obtained her JD from UCLA, where she served as book review editor. So she'll be joining us at the 15-minute mark. That is the 5:15-minute mark. And this week, we will have a special doubleheader. Special edition tomorrow at the 1 o'clock hour. I will be hosting here on air Stephen Kinzer. Stephen spent the most of his 20 years at the New York Times as a foreign correspondent of Central America, recipient of Columbia University's prestigious Maria Moore's Cabot Prize for his work in Latin America. And today, Stephen serves as a senior fellow at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University. He also writes a World Affairs column for the Boston Globe. Kinzer brings to program a talk regarding his book, The True Flag, Theodore Roosevelt, Mark Twain, and the Birth of American Empire. His past work, the brothers, John Foster Dulles, Allen Dulles, and their secret world war, is quoted by the Wall Street Journal as being fluently written, ingeniously researched, thrillerish work of popular history. Having received honorary doctorates from Dominican University of River Frost, Illinois, and University of Scranton, all of Stephen's 5+ books have been well received. In fact, the Washington Post places him among the best in popular foreign policy storytelling. An additional work of highlight is his book, America's Century of Regime Change from Hawaii to Iraq. The piece recounts the 14 times the United States has overthrown foreign governments, and it seeks to explain why these interventions were carried out and what their long-term effects have been. The effects of U.S. intervention in Latin America have been overwhelmingly negative. They have had the effect of reinforcing brutal and unjust social systems and crushing people who are fighting for what we would actually call American values. in many cases. If you take Chile, Guatemala, or Honduras, for example, we actually overthrew governments that had principles similar to ours and replaced those democratic, quasi-democratic, or nationalist leaders with people who detest everything the United States stands for. Quote, end quote, Stephen Kinzer. So he'll be on tomorrow at the 1 o'clock hour, Wynwood Radio. And in about 10 minutes, Ellen Brown will be joining us. What has Ellen written? Well, Public Banking Institute should give you an idea of what she's done. But the two books that I'm privy to are The Web of Debt and The Public Bank Solution. Is there need for a solution to the public banking situation? And what is the public banking situation? Because Bank of America, Wells Fargo, those are public banks, aren't they? It goes a little bit deeper than that. And Ellen will discuss what she speaks of. Because as we know it, U.S. debt is at about 20, 25, somewhere in there, somewhere between there. I know that's a large gap, but let's just settle on 20. Let's just say 20. We'll round down, right? Because that's what we're hoping for here. We'll round down. $20 trillion debt is what the United States government is. So why isn't it fixing that problem? What would it take to fix that problem? And what is the web of debt that Ellen speaks of? So a special doubleheader for you this week. The final day of February the 28th, final day of February, and we'll open up the month with Stephen Kinzer tomorrow. Special Thursday edition at 1 o'clock. Next week, where I'm going to bring on a local group. They call themselves SMASH, Struggle for Miami's Affordable and Sustainable Housing. It's a group dedicated to holding slumlords accountable for keeping their properties compliant with city code and conduct. Group lead Adrian Madriz will join program with his chairperson, Porgy Town. They're aimed at lighting the way for a community that's in darkness. We could all use a little light. Thank you, Thomas Edison. So, last week, we went down the trail that Charlotte Azerbyte paved for us. And, well, she didn't really pay for it. We can thank a fraternity out of Yale that paved things. And we can even actually thank Reagan, I think. She was opposed to a project BEST, B-E-S-T, Better Education Skills Through Technology. That's a project brought about by a Canadian, Dr. John L. Goodlad, the University of Washington. He's quoted as saying, "Parents do not own their children. They have no natural right to control their child's education." Well, that and a few other things Charlotte had an issue with. She was opposed to that type of a viewpoint. So our discussion last week went down a road that is very unexpected. An unexpecting road. And that's where the comment about a Yale fraternity slips in there. Now, I urge you to listen to that episode. I've got all my past episodes archived at SoundCloud, Mixcloud, YouTube. So please do listen to those past episodes, and this past episode in particular with Charlotte. She's a former senior policy advisor for the Department of Education under the Ronald Reagan administration. I also urge you to look at discussions I've had with past guests. That's Mark Shaw, author Ryan Walters, and Senator of Mississippi Chris McDaniel. And also Christopher Bolin. Christopher Bolin wrote a book regards to his research on 9/11. He found some extremely gray areas that he wanted clarification on. And his book, Surviving 9/11, reveals much of, if not all of, that investigation. The other issue I urge you to please take heed with is the vaccine debate. Regardless of side that you take, whether you're for vaccines or you're against vaccines, I can't imagine anyone being completely against vaccines. Pharmaceuticals are necessary. They're important. Cures are more important. That depends on how you look, what your view is. But what I ask you to look into, what I look into, are the ingredients, specifically the life-enhancing ingredients, so the preservatives that are put in vaccines. Also look at the number of vaccines as that number continues to increase. And then I also want you to look at informed consent. Okay, informed consent. Barbara Lowe Fisher, recent guest on show, is fighting for your child's right, and administered through you as parent, to be able to choose, have a choice when it comes to vaccines, to be able to say no to vaccines. So that's another issue of extreme importance. So as we prepare to bring Ellen on, let me briefly run this quote by you. And this is by former California Supreme Court Justice of 1980, Stanford graduate Rose Bird. Now, while Ellen was at UCLA, she did some work, and we'll go into that with her. But briefly, Rose Bird's comments about Ellen's work were this: that they were excellent, they were an exhaustive review of the case and statutory law. So Ellen's an extremely fine researcher, and we'll hear what she has to say about private banking versus public banking. Or should we say the state of banking in this country. I'll cut to a break, and I'll be right back. Thanks for joining Wynwood Radio. I'm your host for discussions, Ian Trottier. Follow me on Twitter. Follow me on Instagram. Follow me on YouTube.
Let you live in my head. As the sun melts your face and drips on my palms, I spew my thoughts, you're eating my past. You said don't get too close cause I am a killer. Aim for your heart so you won't get up. Projections, dreams, crystallized scenes. We brush it off cause it ain't what it seems. Blah blah blah, will I see you again? I had the right laugh, there's no need to pretend that you live in my head. That you live in my head. That you live in my head. I see you, cause you live in my head. I hear you.
Okay, and I am back. Thanks for tuning in to the weekly radio show discussions on Wynwood Radio. I'm your host, Ian Trottier. Today we have an incredible guest on program, Ellen Brown, former practicing lawyer, if not you're still practicing, and certainly author of two very important books, one of them being The Web of Debt. You're the founder and president of the Public Banking Institute. Ellen, are you with us?
I am.
Thanks for joining us. Go ahead.
Thanks for having me.
You're in the Los Angeles area, right?
Right.
How's the weather today?
Sunny, but not really warm. We're having a cold spell, a sunny cold spell.
I see. Okay. Well, Florida, at least South Florida and Miami here, it's nice and warm. Let's get right into first off, maybe tell listeners a little bit about yourself, some sort of an intro, if you would.
Okay, well, I've written 12 books. I'm almost done with my 13th. The first 10 were on health and the politics of health and alternative health care. And I realized at some point that if you really wanted to fix that problem, you had to fix the money problem, because where the medical pharmaceutical cartel got its power was actually through banking, that they were all one conglomerate. So I was an English major at Berkeley before I realized I couldn't make any money writing books. So I went to law school and worked as a lawyer for 10 years. But when then we went in the Foreign Service, or my ex-husband burned out on Beverly Hills Law, and so we went abroad, and that gave me a chance to write. So I wrote on various things. But I had early on researched the Federal Reserve and where our money comes from, and found all that quite interesting and shocking, something that most people weren't aware of. So when I learned that The Wizard of Oz was actually written as a monetary allegory in the 1890s, I had a hook to write this book, and so I spent the next 6 years writing Web of Debt. And then that happened right before. You probably don't want to hear this.
No, I do, and my listeners do. You please continue. This is good stuff.
Okay, so it came out in 2007, and then we had the 2008 collapse. And I had actually predicted that, not because I had any great insights, but it was just I was quoting different people who were predicting that the whole system was shaking and was likely to collapse. And so I started writing articles about it, and I knew that North Dakota was the only state that had its own state-owned banks, so I was watching it. And at first there were 4 states that escaped the credit crisis, that stayed in the black while the others are going into the red, and then there were 3, and then there were 2, and then there was 1, and it was North Dakota. So I suspected the bank may have had something to do with it, so I did a lot of research and started writing articles about that. In fact, it has a very unique system where it actually has more local banks per capita than any other state. So the Bank of North Dakota, its state-owned bank, actually acts as a banker's bank, and so the local banks are like the front office that deal with the customers. So the Bank of North Dakota, by recycling the state's money back into the local economy and back into the public bank or the local banking system, it sort of acts like a cooperative where all the money is kept together and the profits are kept together for the benefit of the public, rather than going off to Wall Street or out of state or even out of the country. And in fact, that's why the Bank of North Dakota was set up 100 years ago. The farmers were losing their farms to the big out-of-state banks, and they decided they wanted to keep their money local, keep it home in North Dakota, and they formed a populist movement, rather like the populist movement of the 1890s that I wrote Web of Debt about, and managed to get this bank set up, and it's been going strong ever since. It's very profitable, and it serves the state.
That's
so now
excellent.
We have,
yeah.
So then that generated a lot of interest, and after a couple of years, so then we formed a Google group and went round and round on all these issues, and after a couple of years we felt like we were the experts, so it was time to get out and actually do something. So we formed the Public Banking Institute, and we've been just trying to educate people on the fact that there is another model for starters. I mean, other countries have large public banking sectors, but we don't. With the U.S. is almost unique in having the Bank of North Dakota is the only state-owned depository bank. So we did that, and now we have quite a bit of interest, and a number of states are talking about or looking into forming their own banks, and cities and counties are as well.
It sounds like you've made quite the impression, and so I had no idea. North Dakota, how I look at from what I've kind of understood about the controlling clause of the Federal Reserve, I wonder how North Dakota was able to kind of sustain that system over the course of a century or longer, and certainly was it just not because of the population in North Dakota, it just wasn't generating enough money. They weren't that big of a player, so the feds didn't really care about them. Does that kind of argument make any sense?
Well, they deal with other banks, including the Federal Reserve. They are not a Federal Reserve member, but they do have an account with the Fed. In fact, you have to have a master account with the Fed if you want to clear checks with other banks. So if you want to be part of the banking system. So they do that. And I think the reason nobody really came after them or, was concerned about this alternative model was that, like you say, it's a small state up there in the north. They kept a low profile. They didn't talk about it. And they just did it, and nobody really paid much attention.
But it's serving the people of North Dakota well, and it's a system that's working well. What are some of the elements that you like of it that would, let's say, your home state or the state there in California, compare and contrast? What are some of the benefits for that system up there in North Dakota? Let's say if it were to apply to California, what would be some of the advantages?
Yeah, well, what's interesting and what I wrote Web of Debt about and what most people don't realize is that banks actually create our money. Like virtually all of our money supply is created by banks when they make loans. the way that so if you want to get new money into your economy, the way to do it is to own a bank, because you're probably not going to be able to get the private banks to do it, or if they do it, your local banks are good. Like the Bank of North Dakota works with the local banks, but your big out-of-state banks are not really interested in stimulating your local economy. And so they're more likely to be extracting money from your economy than actually helping your economy grow. The way banks create money, well, if you want to trace that whole evolution, I think that's pretty interesting how it happened.
Sure.
In the 17th century, goldsmiths would take in people's gold for safekeeping because it was, heavy to carry around and not safe. And they would give him these little paper receipts, these gold receipts, which were more convenient to trade than the actual gold. And so the paper receipts became a major part of the money supply. And then the goldsmiths quickly, some people would want to borrow the gold, and they too liked the paper receipts. So the goldsmiths quickly figured out that they could lend many more paper receipts than they had gold, because most people didn't come for the gold. And that was the beginning of what we call fractional reserve lending. Then in the 19th century in the U.S., states or local state-chartered banks were issuing their own banknotes that had the bank's name on it, and it was basically a promissory note from the bank for gold. It was the same sort of thing, but these were now banknotes instead of goldsmiths' notes. And so they were effectively privately issuing the money supply, issuing these paper notes. And in the 1860s, with the National Bank Act, there was an effort to get the state-chartered banks to join the national banking system, and so they heavily taxed those paper notes that the banks were issuing themselves. So instead of issuing notes, what they started doing was, if somebody came to them for a loan, instead of, like, say it was, time since we've had a lot of inflation since, let's say they came for a $100 loan. Instead of issuing a $100 banknote with the bank's name on it, like they used to do, what they would do is just write that $100 into a checking account for the borrower, and then the borrower himself would write checks on that account. So it was really the borrower who was writing these promissory notes, and so there was no tax. But this sum, this $100 that they wrote into the account, was money they didn't actually have. Supposedly it was backed by gold, but they were doing, again, many more loans than they had gold, and that was how money was created. And so we still have that system today, where if a bank makes a loan, it just writes the sum into the borrower's account, and then the borrower can spend it however he will. And so in order to generate more money for your local economy, if you have a bank, let's say you have, well, right now California has an infrastructure bank that is a revolving fund. So let's say you have $1 billion that you use that you have to lend. So the bank can lend out $1 billion, say at 4%, wait for it to come back, and then lend it out again. And so you get 4% out of that. But if you use that $1 billion to capitalize the bank, you can actually lend $10 billion. You need some deposits to back all that up, but you've got the deposits. If you're a state, you've got a lot of money sitting in Wall Street that are your own state-owned deposits. So if you pull those out of those big out-of-state banks, the local banks are not big enough to handle California's deposits. So you pull that money out of the Wall Street banks, put it into your own bank, and you can then leverage your $1 billion in capital into up to $10 billion in loans. You probably wouldn't do that much, but let's say $7 billion in loans times 4%. So you've just made 28% instead of 4%. So it's very lucrative for the state, as well as now you can direct that credit where your state really needs it, instead of letting Wall Street decide where they want to put it, which which overseas investment they want to put the money into, which isn't going to help your state and may actually drain your state of resources. In North Dakota, the Bank of North Dakota in 2014, an article in the Wall Street Journal said that it was more profitable than Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan Chase, and yet it was making lower interest loans into the local community than the big banks. So how could they do that? They're saving money for the people, for the borrowers, and at the same time they're turning a very nice profit. But how they do it is they're basically eliminating the middlemen, and the interest goes right back to the state. So you could fund your own infrastructure, for example. 50% of the cost of infrastructure is financing. So if you own the bank, you get your infrastructure for half price. So it's a very good deal.
And you're probably stimulating more movement. Would that be accurate? There's probably more borrowing, more lending going on.
Right. I think I saw somebody calculated out that you get 1.5 times back just from the stimulation of the local economy. Besides what you've made on the actual loans, you turn another 50% profit just from, the local government, just from generating more business in the community, which then pays more taxes.
Now, okay, so what is it? So you started out looking into alternative health care, and I want you to go into that because that's extremely important. But what you're very logically, you said, wait a second, this is all stimulated by banking, and so what was it that caught your alarm in regards to the Federal Reserve?
Well, I had already read back in the 1970s when I was trying to be a writer before I went to law school. I had already researched the Federal Reserve. I think I read Eustace Mullins, which is, heavily conspiratorial stuff, but it's just so interesting. It was just stuff that I'd never heard of before, and I thought, well, that's shocking, the fact that we have this central bank that controls its things, and that and the more I researched, the more interesting it got. But then, of course, I was busy. I have 2 kids, so I was busy raising kids and working as a lawyer, and all that got, pushed in the background.
Yeah.
And then I started writing, and I represented a cancer therapist, an alternative cancer therapist in Tijuana, who was kidnapped by the FBI basically, taken from Tijuana back to Louisiana, tried for fraud, the alleged fraud of saying he had a high rate of success with cancer, but he actually did have a high rate of success with cancer.
He did.
I knew the person who told me that he needed a lawyer, and at first I needed somebody to write an article, and so I wrote an article, and he liked the article, and he didn't trust his current lawyers, so he wanted a second team. So I agreed to help with his lawsuit. So over the next 7 years, I spent a lot of time, interviewing him. He was in jail there for a while, and he just had such. He was totally coming from a different place than I was. I was a California Democrat, and he was a hardcore Louisiana Republican, but very suspicious of government, and just knew a lot about things that were just new to me, and it was just so interesting. As a writer, you really go for the interesting stuff.
Sure.
I thought, well, that's interesting and shocking and worth writing about.
So, what was it? Would just keep on that course there. What was the outcome with this fellow?
Oh, well, in the end, he passed away he had a massive stroke, but it wasn't cancer. He had gotten cancer but he did spend 4 years in jail, and that was pretty traumatic. And he had all these people at his trial who were saying they were going to die if he stayed in jail. And I don't know, the jury I guess they thought those people were lying, but I knew those people and they weren't lying, and A lot of them did die.
So did Eustace Mullins take you down a road into Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson and some of the early kind of preliminary groundwork for the for the system that would kind of be chipped away at, from what I'm understanding, and leading up into the 1913 Federal Reserve Act with Woodrow Wilson? Was there anything along that road that Mullins kind of helped you gain an interest in?
Well, in truth, I read that in the 70s, so I can't even remember what was in. I read 2 of his books, I think. But it just tipped me off to that was an interesting place to look. So then I did a lot of research from all sorts of writers. And I was a bit naive. We went to Africa for 3 years, and then we were in Guatemala for 5 years, and 2 years in Honduras. And so I was writing from afar. Well, then I came back to state. I shouldn't say I was that naive. But anyway, after I wrote a lot of things, I realized I was really walking on the edge without even realizing it. I was just reporting what I had read, and I got into not serious trouble, but what I mean, I've gotten a lot more circumspect about checking my sources.
I see.
Yeah.
You ran for treasurer of the state of California, and at about the same time, you had an opinion piece appear in the New York Times. The title of that opinion piece is "Public Banks Are Key to Capitalism." What is the kind of overall, if you can describe that? Because I think that's, I'm thinking as I'm hearing you talk about the banking system in North Carolina, and the lower interest rates, and then being reinvested into the infrastructure. I'm thinking, wait a second, that's kind of that's a great scenario for anyone. I think your book, The Web of Debt, and it just seems like there's so much great debt that most of average Americans are just wallowing in debt. They're working their 9 to 5 and painstakingly trying to get their families fed and their bills paid, and it's like the majority, and then they're getting these exorbitant taxes from their states, and it just seems like it's not capitalism. It's almost like it's almost anti-capitalism. What are your thoughts?
Well, Jamie Galbraith wrote in a book, I remember him writing, that 50% of every economy is half capitalist, half public, half private. In other words, obviously, you need the public sector, right? I mean, nobody disputes that we need roads, and we need...
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people dispute that we need the
Police
military, but we've got the military. Actually, our 50% actually goes into the military, which is
huge.
Most people don't approve of that, but there doesn't seem to be much that we can do about it. We don't really have control over our own government. But anyway, you need public resources. All those things that here's the way I look at it. Yeah. All those things that flow, that we share, that communicate, make people interact. So you've got power and electricity and water and highways, and these are all things that connect people. Well, money lines also is a flow. Once you realize that money is not gold, it's not bits of things. Today, our money, it's not dug out of the ground. Today, our money is pluses and minuses. It's zeros and ones. It's debits and credits. The money is created as a debit by a bank, and you pay that off, and it goes back to zero. So it goes, you've got like $100 in your account, but you've also got a minus 100 in the books, and you've got to pay that back. And so that's where money comes from. It's created on the books. So it's all a flow. It's a flow of it's information. It's who owes what to whom. It's an exchange. And if you put that in private hands, if you allow people to actually create the money that other people have to borrow in order to. You can't get money any other way. Somebody has to borrow it. I mean, you may get it from your employer, but your employer had to borrow it. Somebody borrowed it into existence somewhere along the chain. And since all those loans are at interest, more money is always owed back than was borrowed in the first place. Now, you could theoretically, so you can see that this debt has to just grow and grow just to keep paying, just to stay afloat. You could, in theory, pay off the loan with less money than you started with, because if the lender gives the money back every month, in other words, let's say you only pay by the month. So let's say you pay $1,000 every month, and then the lender, the bank, hires you to. Ed Griffin used this example where the bank hires you to scrub their floors, and they pay you $1,000 a month. So you get the money back, and then you can pay it again and again. But what are you? You're a debt slave to this bank, for starters, and they don't hire their borrowers to scrub their floors. That money does not go back into the real economy. Most of it goes off into the speculative economy. So we've actually got these two economies going, and it's the productive, the laboring economy that's supporting both of them. So this system just can't work. I mean, it is working in the sense that we're getting exploited, and it's working for some people and not for others. But there must be a better way to do it, and the better way, it seems to me, is if you do return that money to the center so that it's available to keep the whole thing circulating. And a public banking system does that. The interest goes back to the government, which is the public, or owned by the public. So then, assuming you have an honest government, which is another issue, but anyway, so then the government spends that into the economy for infrastructure, or for hiring people, or for education, all those things that serve people. So then they have access to those funds, and then they can pay off their loans, and the thing goes back to zero and it balances, and we could have a sustainable system. And there are countries that have had such a system, and it's worked quite well.
What's one country that stands out in your mind?
Well, I would say, the one that works the best is actually China, and of course that is not
interesting.
Even if they claim to be capitalist, we all know they're not exactly capitalist. Right. But Germany is an excellent example, because 50% of their commercial banks are nonprofits. They're not actually owned by the government, but they're not owned by anyone. So they're not private. They're not private banks. And these are the Sparkassen banks. They've been around for more than 100 years, I think 200 years. And they service the local business, and they are a major factor in the success of the German economy. I mean, if you consider that the German economy was like totally wiped out after World War II,
right.
And somehow they got to be number one again in Europe. How did they do that? It's the Sparkassen group anyway claims that they did it. That they were funding their local businesses.
Now, who are some of the people that you have interested right now in your public banking platform? There's people from entire states. What are some of the interested parties that you're working with now?
Well, I'm in California, so of course our state treasurer is interested. John Chung he's working up a feasibility study for it. His particular interest is a place to park the cannabis money, because we've now legalized marijuana in this state for recreational purposes. So it's anticipated to be a $7 billion business, with $1 billion going to taxes. Well, the government has an obvious interest in keeping an eye on that tax money.
Sure.
And they're worried about crime. The police are worried about people stash all this paper dollar bills in their basements. And even just the inconvenience of, they come in with these, I heard somebody say, they come in with these bags of dollar bills to pay their taxes. It smells of marijuana. Somebody's got to count all that stuff. I guess they have counting machines. But anyway, it's just very inconvenient. It would be much better if they were allowed to use a banking system and it would all be numbers. Plus, the reason it's illegal, it's called money laundering. Well, the biggest money launderers are the state of California and the U.S. government. The U.S. government takes that money in taxes. Why are they allowed to turn dirty money into clean money, but a bank is not allowed to? Anyway, there's there's lawsuits going on over that, or there's bills and so forth. So he's interested from that angle. In L.A., where I live, there was a resolution by the city that they will form. Well, first of all, there was a resolution to move their money out of Wells Fargo because of corruption. Well, if you pull it out of Wells Fargo, then where do you put it? And the city of LA is many times bigger than North Dakota. I mean, they have a lot of deposits. So they can't just put it in your local credit union. So the obvious partner to that push was to form a publicly owned bank and put it in their own bank. So they're working on that. And in New Jersey, we have great hopes for New Jersey. The newly elected governor, Phil Murphy, was a banker at Goldman Sachs. So it was our people who suggested this idea, said, have you heard of public banking? And as soon as he thought about it, having been a banker, knowing how banking works, he could easily see that he could make the state could turn a profit on it. That this could be a good arrangement for the state. So he's been in office like just a month, and they've already got a bill on for a state-owned bank. So they're moving on that. We've had a number of bills over the years, and they, like in California in 2011, I think there was a bill for a feasibility study for a state-owned bank. Passed both houses of the legislature, and then Governor Jerry Brown wouldn't sign it. He said his reasoning was we don't need another blue ribbon committee. We've already got a banking committee. We can do this in-house. But they didn't do it. Apparently that's where bills go to die. And so it's sort of what you need is the political will, in other words. But Phil Murphy has the political will, so that's great. And John Chung in California has the political will. He wants to figure out what to do with that cannabis money. And a number of states have, Washington State has a feasibility study going. A number of cities here in California, I think Oakland, can't remember who else. San Francisco, so the city of Seattle, the city of Philadelphia. Well, anyway, so there are a number of, Michigan has a bill, a newly filed bill on, so there are a number of these bills going, and this is kind of our second round of bills, so we've gotten older and wiser and know better how to approach it, so hopefully we'll be successful one of these days.
That's great. That's wonderful. And who are some of the, of course, you're helping New Jersey and the Los Angeles. You're helping them kind of create the structure for this public banking format?
Well, I'm just a writer, of course, and the Public Banking Institute is a nonprofit, so we're not allowed to lobby or really get all that politically involved, but what we do is just make information available, and we write and we do the ordinary blogs and social media and interviews and whatever comes up.
Now, how about the local or the average? If somebody listening, a listener that's intrigued in this sort of thing, what's the advice that you could give the average everyday American?
Well, there are, if you want to work on your own state or your own city, there are people all over the country working on this now, but if you wanted to write or email to publicbankinginstitute.org or to me, or let's see, I think you could do info@publicbankinginstitute.org, and just inquire, and we can tell you who you could contact to get, to join a group that's actively pursuing a bank wherever you are.
Sure, wonderful. A few more, a final kind of comment, if you have any, in regards to the cryptocurrency, which is basically an attempt to decentralize the money, and it's I guess in some ways it kind of threads in and weaves into that of public banking. But what are your thoughts on that angle of a cryptocurrency push?
Well, it's a noble idea.
Yeah.
But the current, Bitcoin, for example, could not replace the U.S. dollar, and the reason is, first of all, it's very expensive to produce.
Right.
It's very environmentally unfriendly.
Yeah.
And
a lot of energy. Electricity.
Sorry?
A lot of electricity.
Yeah. Right. And the way it's set up, it's very slow. So even right now, it can take several hours. So you wouldn't want to stand in line for several hours to get your cup of coffee. But if you scale it up so that everybody across the country is using it, the problem is that every single transaction has to register in every, each of those transactions is captured forever.
Uh-huh.
And so it gets slower and slower the more people use it. So if you scaled that up, you could be standing in line for days. I mean, it's not practical for cheap, for little trades, the things that make up most of our daily consumer trades. But it's quite good for if you have big money that's going across international lines or something, or black market type stuff, or you're in China and you're trying to get your money out. You're trying to avoid regulations. It's definitely got its uses. And meanwhile, all these other cryptocurrencies are coming out that purport to overcome a lot of those challenges. I mean, they may one day come up with one that actually works. But personally, I would prefer to clean up the government and have a centralized currency. Because what happens even if you have a totally secure currency, let's say you trade with somebody in China, and what if they don't send you the goods that they were supposed to send you? Who are you going to sue? You can't go to Amazon, or you can't go to, you don't have any big central place that's going to get, or the bank. You can't go to your credit card and say, this is a fraudulent charge, reverse the charges. Your money's gone. It's just disappeared into the ether because it's that anonymous. Right. So there's much to be said for government. Government also protects us. That's why we pay our taxes. We want all those benefits that we get from that big protective thing around us that we all share.
Do you have any comments in regards to alternative health or healthcare?
Well, the problem with our current system is that it's half public and half private. I mean, the government is basically willing to pay whatever the market will bear, and the market just drives those prices up and up and up. But so a lot of people turn to alternatives because they're cheaper, for one thing. But I think with the internet, I just totally believe that our bodies are not designed to take in these toxic things that, in order to patent something, you have to alter its chemical structure. So it can't be natural. You can't patent a natural thing. Well, clearly your body wants the natural things. That's what it thrives on. So you're much better off getting into alternative natural type therapies. And now with the internet, we can really largely be our own doctors. Of course, you can't do your own surgeries, but you can definitely at least give yourself a second opinion. Do some research and find out if there isn't some alternative way to do things. Because it's amazing what people have put on the internet. They just give their own experiences of, I tried baking soda for this or whatever. They'll just tell you it. It's just like you can fix your car. You can do almost anything on the internet these days, or from reading about it on the
YouTube.
internet.
Ellen, do you have some parting thoughts for listeners? And of course, I would like you to again repeat your website or any other social media outlets that you'd like them to hear. So some parting remarks or comments, and then website.
Well, I know everybody's like frightened and worried about what's happening to the economy, but my feeling, I feel actually very optimistic. I think we're at a time of great change. We're living in revolutionary times, and there is so much potential out there for coming out with new systems. And you've got to get rid of the old systems before you can build a new. I mean, I don't want to see the whole thing come crashing down, but my goal would be to fix it before it comes crashing down. Realize what the problem is, and let's see if we can't just, tweak this system around and make it actually work. So my website, or our website for Public Banking Institute, is publicbankinginstitute.org, and my own website is ellenbrown.com, and I guess and my two books that are particularly on this subject are Web of Debt and The Public Bank Solution, and my book that I'm almost done with is called The Coming Revolution in Banking, Democratizing Money in the Digital Age.
Beautiful. I love it. Wonderful. Thank you, Ellen. Such an honor, and wonderful to have you on the program, and I'll be in touch. Thank you so much, Ellen.
Oh, great. Great to talk to you. Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, Ian.
Ladies and gentlemen, author and I guess I can say legal analyst, former lawyer, practicing attorney, Ellen Brown. You heard her mention she's authored over 12 books. Sounds like she's working on what would be the 13th, almost done with the 13th. But the most notable is The Web of Debt, the shocking truth about our money system and how we can break free. Folks, I'll be right back after a short break. You're turning into Discussions. I'm your host, Ian Trottier. This is Winwood Radio. And welcome back. I'm your host, Ian Hamilton Trottier. Check me out on Twitter at IANTROTTIER. That's Ian Trottier. Check me out on Instagram. That's IANTROTTIER. Yeah, you can find me on Facebook. I don't use Facebook that much, but I'm certainly on SoundCloud and Mixcloud and YouTube. You've been tuning into Wynwood Radio. Well, you're tuning in. You're tuned in to Wynwood Radio. And you've just listened to the amazing Ellen Brown talk about public banking institution. I mean, come on, seriously? North Dakota? Like, right? Okay, guys. Ellen's on to something incredibly good. Sounds like the folks in North Dakota have had something incredibly good for well over 100 years. I have not been through North Dakota. I've been through South Dakota. Close to, well, I've been to Mount Rushmore. Unless I've got those two states mixed around, I believe that is South Dakota. South Dakota on over into Minnesota. I didn't make it up to North Dakota, however. But it sounds like they have, again, to repeat myself, they have had something good for a while. And if you just do a quick Google query, you'll find that we, as a populace, a people, gathered under the flag of the United States of America, we're in debt. And we're in a lot of it. We're in a web of debt that has many layers and is filthy. It's disgusting. And Ellen sounds like she's got an incredible way to fix that. You don't grab the attention of New Jersey or even one of the largest cities and certainly most wealthy cities in the world, that is Los Angeles, if you don't have a system that works. In fact, as you heard her say, she has the current California State Treasurer interested in her format. Tomorrow, special edition, right here, 1 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Stephen Kinzer, former New York Times columnist, correspondent of Central America. He'll be on talking about the true flag. That'll be some good stuff. I'm going to repeat the name of one of his previous books just because, hey, look, this is one of our liberties. Freedom of speech, freedom of media, freedom of press. That means, dude, you find something of interest, go out and search it. Search it out. Weed it out. Seek and, if need be, destroy. Ellen and those who agree with her are doing just that, hopefully, for the current banking system. Destroy it. Well, alter it. Change it. Make it a soft destruction. The Brothers is the title of the book. John Foster Dulles, Alan Dulles, and their secret World War. Woo-hoo-hoo. That's a very stark title. If you're not familiar with the Dulles brothers, you're not sure who they are, you want to check out that book. For your Wednesday edition of Discussions with Ian Trottier on Wynwood Radio, it has been my pleasure. And I'll be back for a special edition tomorrow at 1 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'm your host, Ian Trottier, IanTrottier.com. And until then, thank you for listening, and be awesome.